Welcome back to the channel. My name is Rob and today we are going to be painting an Ultramarines Terminator with a sponge. So if you are somebody who doesn't own an airbrush and wants to paint their Space Marines quickly, then this is the tutorial for you. This is off of the back of two previous sponge tutorials that I have done, and I thought what better way to carry it on than to do the boys in blue themselves, the Ultramarines, which is my own personal heresy army as well. So I've got a great affinity for them. So we're going to start off with our Terminator primed in a dark brown colour. You could start in a black as well if you wanted to. You'll notice that I have left the armour plating off of the Terminator on the fist. You'll see why in a bit, and I've left the head off as well. And we have our makeup sponge. So you can get these from Amazon. I think I got, I don't know, like a bag of 20 of them for like £7 or something. They're pretty dirt cheap, but they're not particularly reusable unless you wash them straight away. So we're going to start off with our Imperial Navy colour, and then we're going to go and use this dark blue colour all over our model using our makeup sponge. Now, the makeup sponge allows us to build up volumetric highlights, and by that all I mean is where the light hits the armour, that's where it's going to be nice and bright and light, and where the light cannot get to the armour, that's where it's going to remain dark. So this is quite good to create a form of highlights and shading that you typically see when using an airbrush, but just not using an airbrush. Now, people asked me in the last tutorial, how do I get to those hard to reach places? Just like this. You basically rip off a bit of the sponge, not the pointy bit, but maybe the one of the back end bits. You hold it with a pair of tweezers and get into the nooks and crannies this way. Somebody said, you can't do it. And I said, yes, you can. You just need to break it off. It does take a little bit of time, a little bit of patience, and sometimes you might need to dab a brush in there into those really hard to reach places. But once you've done the base color, really you don't need to kind of worry too much about getting into the nooks and crannies again, because it's just the initial base color that we need to worry about, and then we can move on to our big sponge. Now I can use the tweezers a little bit later on if I do find that there's some hard to reach places, but the sponge, this larger sponge just like this is a great tool to create volumetric highlights. So we're going to move on to crystal blue now. This is part of the vivid blue triads, but we're actually going to move away from the vivid blues in a bit when we move to shield wall blue. But what you can see me doing here is imagining a highlight coming from a 45-degree, the sunlight coming from a 45-degree arc from the front and highlighting the armor, and then we've also got a light source coming from the back as well. The light source will obviously hit the top of the shoulders, so we've got this really cool fade on the shoulders, and then on the front of the legs as well we've got a nice bright line going down the front of the armor on the legs, and then it kind of fades off to the as it moves into the shadows on the side as well. But it's a really useful tool to be able to create some volumetric highlights. And then I'm moving to shield wall blue, which is one of the deep green blues to highlight this, and you can see here I'm actually just going straight to the sponge, but with a pair of tweezers. This is because I needed to keep the highlights quite tight in order to do this bit, so I kind of felt at this point it was probably right to do it with tweezers so I could be a bit more precise with it. You can see here that there's quite a jump between the crystal blue and then the shield wall blue, and what I do with this sponge, I don't add any water to it. I just kind of mush it in just to kind of make a nice smooth transition. Lots of people also ask me about whether I thin the paint. No, I don't thin the paint. This is just straight onto a dry palette, actually, not even onto a wet palette. This is just literally me dabbing it off on the table, dabbing it off on some sponge off camera, and then putting it on. I think that practice I think is really important, and do a test piece before you do it on your actual Marines. I found there was a bit of trial and error when I first did this as well, so make sure you do practice on a mini that you don't kind of worry about. Then we're going to go to dark blue tone here. Now this is just to smooth out those transitions a little bit more, add a little bit more contrast into the miniature. I don't actually think relatively this is a really important step. This is probably an important step when we did the Sons of Medusa model, because we were kind of introducing like oranges and browns, but this is just really just to smooth out some of those sponge transitions, but also just to add more contrast into it as well. This is just straight from the pot. Again, this isn't even on a wet palette. I think this is on a dry palette, in fact, but you can see that it's just smooth things out a little bit and just darken down the parts where the light is not hitting, creating that sick fade that I'm always talking about. Right, we're going to move on to transfers next. Now you'll notice the model is glossy. That's because I have gloss varnished it. You could use an airbrush for this using Army Painter's gloss varnish, or you could use a rattle can gloss varnish, or you could use something like a car lacquer. So, you know, Halford's car lacquer is really good, Rust-Oleum is really good, you know, all those kind of heavy duty gloss varnishes are all really, really excellent. And you'll notice that I won't be painting on my checks. I'm going to use a transfer. This is from Bedlam Creations. I use them a lot for 30k Dark Angels, but they do like really, really small checks. Absolutely brilliant company. They're based over in the States, but they always arrive really quickly and really reasonably costed as well. And I'm just putting it to the end. I did consider doing the whole fist in checks, but I thought it would just be more tasteful if I did, you know, just did half of it. You can see here me applying the micro set. I apply the transfer on over the top of that, and then from there I'll be adding micro sol. Just make fine adjustments with your knife rather than your brush. I always find you have a bit more control doing it with a knife. And it's up to you where you put your transfers and which transfers that you obviously use. I do find some of the 40k ones a little bit pixelated, so if you don't like the pixelation within the transfer sheet, you can look at the 30k version, and they're very, very nice. In this next part, I'm using micro sol just with a Q-tip or a cotton wool bud, and just pressing it down, just rolling it over the transfer area. I'll leave that to dry for a bit, and I'll come back to it and do exactly the same. Sometimes, because this is going over some, I guess, some rivets, some rather large rivets, but sometimes air bubbles can form. You can just pop those with your sharp knife, and this is what it looks like when it's ready to go. And I have given that another gloss to protect those transfers. Now I will come back to that in a little bit because I didn't gloss them enough, and I'll talk about why that was and how we can correct that as well. But we're going to gloss it because we're going to be using white spirits on our model, and the white spirits can be quite harsh against the transfers. So it's good to protect the transfers, I think. So we're going to be using lamp black and Prussian blue, Winsor & Newton oil colours. We're going to add just a few drops of white spirit, and we're going to create quite a thick mixture. Perhaps you've been and seen my previous videos where I talk about this being kind of like a milky consistency. This is thicker than milk. You can actually see how thick it is now. You know, this is probably what, 6-7 drops of oil, so it's quite thick, and it needs to be for the next step, which is we're going to drown our model in this wash. Some people haven't used oils before. I had quite a few questions about it. My first response is always give them a go, right? What could go wrong? If you've got a spare miniature, you know, just practice. White spirit, a couple of oils, a gloss varnish. You could use as I say, like a car lacquer or something like that. And yeah, that's going to set you back about what, like 30 quid, $40 or something like that, just to give this kind of technique a go. In terms of other things you could use some speed paints, some washes, and then wipe it away or wick it away quickly. But the benefit this has is that it stains the overall model, and it will start to stain the transfers as well in I think quite a realistic way that makes them kind of look painted on, and just adds further contrast to the miniature as well. As I say though, you could use a wash or a speed paint as long as you wick it away quickly. You could add some retarder to it, some glazed medium or something that just stops the drying process if you're using one of those. But yeah, try yours, see how you get on with it. I can highly recommend them. So you can see here with a clean cotton wool bud with a Q-tip, I am wiping away the oils after about probably, I don't know, like 90 minutes I would say. Haven't left it very long, I haven't left it overnight. I think I just left it over lunchtime actually, and kind of did this, ate my lunch, came back and then ready to rock and roll. And you can see me here just wiping it away. I haven't cleaned this in any white spirit at all. I'm just kind of trying to take as much of the excess off as possible without introducing any white spirit, but I will a little bit later just to uncover some of those highlights, use some white spirit. And then you can see here we've got our transfers. This is almost it. Now, I accidentally, with our cotton wool bud, wiped away some of the transfers, the check transfers, which I clearly hadn't protected with gloss varnish enough, and kind of had wiped it away with that Q-tip. So what I decided to do was kind of just make it look a little bit like battle damage, and just kind of nicked away at the transfers to kind of like fade in that that corner that I kind of like wiped away. I would recommend doing this stage earlier than the second gloss varnish, but you can just with a knife kind of like dig into it and reveal some of that blue underneath, and it kind of looks like realistic weathering. And then you can see here I've given it a matte varnish. So this is now good to go. You could use a matte varnish through a rattle can or a matte varnish through the airbrush. I'll leave it up to you. I've done some videos before talking about kind of like using oils, and I've talked about some matte varnishes that you could use there. But now we're going to go on to some edge highlights. So this is the bit that's a little bit time consuming. You don't have to add edge highlights, but I think it does look and make the model feel quite neat and tidy, and it just makes the model pop. I think also it lightens the model up. Edge highlights just have a very natural way of lightening everything up, despite the armour being a relatively dark blue. But it is time consuming. And also you need a relatively steady hand to be able to do this process. I find the Terminators quite forgiving to edge highlight, but some of the actual Primaris Marines themselves are a little bit harder to do. I find the Terminators a little bit easier, but yeah, practice makes perfect, I think. So worth practicing the skill, especially on kind of these kind of models, which are slightly easier to edge highlight. Right, we're going to use Aegis Aqua and Matte White just mixed together in a 50-50 ratio. And what you can see me doing here is just dotting the very corners of our model. You don't have to do every single corner. The most prominent ones are the most important, but just go around. I think this edge highlighting process and kind of this dotting process probably took me about 30 minutes to 45 minutes to do one model, but it does make the whole model pop and really zing. So I think it is worth the extra effort. All right, we're going to move on to Banshee Brown. So this is from the new John Blanche Masterclass set, so it can't be bought as an individual model paint at the moment. But I'm sure they will drop as individuals later on. And you can see here what I'm doing is just going over the top of these scratches just to add in kind of wear and tear to the armour. You could add a little bit of sponge chipping if you wanted to here. I decided not to. Nothing personal against sponge chipping, but I just made a conscious choice not to do that. But I think you could definitely just do that if you wanted, as well as adding these kind of like 3D scratches in. We're going to move on to Matte White. You've seen that if you watch the last two previous videos that I did, you'll know that this is kind of like a process that I'll go through quite a lot in these videos, which is kind of doing the foundations of all our later steps, which is to add white onto or base coat white all of the areas and extra details. So this goes for the cabling, the soft armor, purity seals, the crux terminatus, etc. All those gets a base coat of white. Next up, we're going to use 3 parts Battleship Grey and 1 part Grim Black, and then we're going to go over the Crux Terminatus on the knee and the Crux Terminatus on the shoulder pad, and we are just going to wash these 2 things in our speed paint mix, and we'll do some further highlights a little bit later. If you can just find, Gravelord Grey is quite a good one to do this in as well, if you have that one. Sorry, Cloudburst Blue is quite a good one to do this in, because it creates quite a similar colour. But you want something quite gentle, quite soft, which is why I use the Battleship Grey here. Just make sure to get all the nooks and crannies with this. And then we're going to move on to the next step, which is adding a little bit of speed paint medium, a little bit of the Battleship Grey, a little bit of the Grim Black, and then some white paint, pure white paint, matte white. And then we're going to mix them together, and this is going to be our first highlight. Now you can do this on a wet palette if you want to. I think I literally just had my dry palette in front of me here, so that's why I chose to do it on this. So we've got a very, very light grey colour here. And this is going to be our first highlight for our Crux Terminatus, as well as the Crux Terminatus on the knee. I'm not even sure if the one on the knee is actually called a Crux Terminatus or not. It's the kind of exactly the same shape, right? And then we can just add our highlights in. So thinking about where the light is hitting, it's kind of directionally, it's straight from above really in the angle of this Crux Terminatus. So just getting all those kind of like top highlights, top of the skull, and this just neatens the whole thing up. And rather than starting from, say, a dark grey and then building up, I just find that this process is a little bit easier, and a little bit more forgiving, but still looks good and renders really good results, I think. But if you're doing like a competition piece, for example, your best of your best painting, you probably wouldn't go about it in this way. I think you kind of like build it up from a darker grey and then up to a pure white. But this is just a relatively quick way to do it. Right, on to the Aquila on the front. So we're going to do a base coat of Greedy Gold. I did go around the whole of the edges with this with Banshee Brown. Really, you just base coat it in Banshee Brown first, and then hit with Greedy Gold. I was just being lazy and just did the kind of edges. And the reason I did that is because you want a distinction between the blue armor and the Greedy Gold. You almost want like an outline between the two. And that's because it just makes it look neat and tidy. I wouldn't do that for everything. I just find with gold it's kind of important to do, just so you have a distinction between the 2 parts. We're going to use Warrior Skin straight from the pot. Like, it is not thinned with any speed paint medium in any way. It's just literally we're using it essentially as a wash, but it flows really nicely in towards the nooks and crannies and creates a really warm gold. So Greedy Gold I would describe it as quite warm anyway, but this just really, really warms it up. And again, you could leave it like this if you wanted to. If you were trying to cut a few steps, you could leave it like this. But what I did next was then go in with some Greedy Gold just to render the shapes and create some highlights. You do have to work at quite a small level with these little Aquila wings. And then if you want to add in some shiny silver into that Greedy Gold, just to do kind of like the very corners and the very edges, then you can do that if you want to as well. But that's a quick way to do some kind of like Aquila, gold Aquilas on the front of your Marines. Right, we're going to whiz through this really quickly now, because I actually showed you guys this on the last video, which is exactly the same. So we're going to use some washes to paint our face. So it's not too complicated. So we're going to be using, to start off with, dark red tone on the bottom of the face. Then we're going to be using dark blue tone. These are all washes, not proper paints as you might describe, just washes. Dark blue tone around the eyes, leave that to dry. Then we're going to use the flesh tone, warm skin shade all over the face, and we're going to leave that to dry, and then we'll do a second one of that once it's all dry. Then with Barbarian Flesh, I do some highlights. I thin this quite a lot with some water, and I just add some highlights to the flesh, just leaving behind the kind of like the recesses. So we've got kind of different tones within the face there that makes it more interesting, and everything's just kind of smoothed out and blended out. And then this is what it looks like at the end. Add the eyes on. I didn't do that on camera because it's a complete nightmare to do with a with a camera in the way. And then I just use some speed paint, blood red, I think it was. Yeah, blood red for the kind of half helmet thing he's got going on. Slaughter red is used on the lenses here. Really quick way to do this. You can be a bit slapdash with this, hit underneath it to give the idea that it's glowing. So if you accidentally catch the rim around the bottom, that's absolutely fine. You want that really. So Slaughter red speed paint, not thinned. Then we're going to use matte white, and we're going to hit right in the center of that lens. Then we're going to use Power Node Glow, which is kind of like a fluorescent magenta. And we're just going to hit that in the center of it. And that is our glowing lens. That is the end of it. You don't need to do any more than that. They're teeny tiny, so didn't spend that long doing it. I used just a dark texture kind of product on the bottom of the base here, and then just dry brushing it with Paratrooper Tan. And actually you could leave it like this. Like I was looking at this being like, oh, this is actually pretty good, like I should just leave it like this, but I did want to use some weathering powders, so I did change my mind. And I've used like a dark ochre, dark red weathering powder here, something between a brown and a red here, and then just took a little bit, you don't need a lot here, and then just mushed it into the base. I didn't even seal this. I was confident that actually it would stay on the base. I haven't used a lot of weathering powders, and even if I played with it, I'd be confident that unless I literally put my finger into those weathering powders, they would stay. You can see that I'm not using a lot, so yeah, you can be fairly confident in this kind of example and situation that actually they're not going to be removed. And then this is our model. This is it. This is finished. The wax purity seal was done with Slaughter red, and then just mixed a little bit of white in to do some highlights. The actual kind of scroll parchment paper was just like a Tomb King tan, then given a wash, and then did some writing on it. But that's it. That's all finished. I did want to show you an example compared against an airbrush, so exactly the same colours, but just done with an airbrush, so slightly smoother kind of finish to the overall piece. But actually, there's not a lot of difference really between the two. So both look pretty cool, I think. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope it was useful for you guys wanting to kind of create some cool looking Ultramarines. If you haven't subscribed, then please make sure you do. I really appreciate all the new subscribers. I think we've had well over 1,000 new subscribers in the last few days, so that's absolutely amazing. I appreciate all your support. Don't forget to like the video, don't forget to leave a comment, and I shall see you on the next one. Take care, guys.